Okay, so we're recording. Hello everybody, welcome to onos-TST. It's, I guess, start of the second half of the 2020. Let's hope it's going to be a little bit better than the first. This is a public and recorded meeting, and today on the agenda we have a couple of different items, but most of them are just pertinent to micro-onos. But before I launch into that, I also want to make sure everybody's aware of the fact that yesterday we cut out a release, RC for a release of 2.40 of Onos Classic. It's now undergoing QA tests, and if everything goes well, we will probably release 2.4 before too long, hopefully by the end of the week, and if not so, probably sometimes next week. Anyway, with that, let's switch to the main agenda, and the first, and that is the primary topic, is a discussion of onos topology enhancements. Now Shad will be leading that, but let me first lead into it by saying that onos-topo up to this point was primarily used as a kind of a very skeletal subsystem for micro-onos, only to support the work required by with features required by onos config, which is a subsystem that we worked on last year. And as such, it only contains basically just an inventory of devices and their management addresses for onos config. And beyond that, currently, it really doesn't allow us to depict the data plane topology or, in fact, control plane topology. And so Shad has started to take a look at how to enhance onos topology, and I'm going to now pass it over to Shad. Would you like to share, or do you just want me to advance through the slides?
No, Thomas, you can just advance through the slides. So let's start with the first one. Yeah.
Whoops, that's automatic releases. One second, I'm going to have to skip here.
Yeah, oh, yeah, sorry.
There we go.
I put into the. So, hi guys. So, as Thomas mentioned, onos-topo currently models the RAN as a flat list of generic E2 nodes. As we're looking at refining the onos-topo, we will need to look at the use cases and applications that would use onos-topo. And one suggestion is to start with, just as an exercise, to start modeling the interfaces in addition to the devices. And we could start with modeling the E2 interface itself, which is between the RIC and the E2 nodes, and the interface between the E2 nodes, specifically the ones between the CU, CP. Yeah, so here we have. So this is my, one view, my view of kind of summarizing all the control interfaces that we may need to interact with. So if we were to model include the E2 link in our model, then maybe we also need a representation for the onos RIC itself, maybe. That's, for example, that's something that the ORAN is discussing as how to model the RIC itself and even whether to model the apps. Well, getting into the XN interface, that's an interface between the base stations. For 5G, it is the XN. For 4G, it is LTE, it is the X2. It is of significance to us because it is involved during handover, something that we have not been dealing with at this point. But as we get to refine our handover modeling, handover implementation, and the E2 interface, the real implementation of the E2 interface, I think we'll need to tackle the XN or even the X2 interface. The X2, in our case, may be of significance if we have to deal with interworking with LTE, something that maybe real deployments would need. So Thomas, yeah, moving to the next one. So keeping an eye out on what ORAN is doing, ORAN is defining information and data models. There's a subtask, there's a group within the working group one, there's a subtask group which is defining these. They are, as much as possible, reusing 3GPP models, which are Yang based. So if we move on to our next slide, we'll get a feel for where is ORAN moving with these modeling. So this is AT&T's view from one of their proposals of how they would be using the models, in the data models, information models, and ORAN interfaces defined by ORAN. So you can see over here very clearly that they have a northbound ONAP, and that uses netconf Yang, the ORAN interface, to configure the devices and even the your network functions or physical devices, or even the RIC itself. In the opposite direction from the devices or the RIC towards the OSS BSS, the northbound is they're using HTTP a REST interface, O1 REST interface for notifications going north. So this gives us a view of how the rationale behind ORAN's definitions of their data model. Looks like they're using the data model and the information model, and O1 is going to be used by an external OSS BSS to configure, provision, manage the RAN, including the RIC. So this is something good to know, and we with our RIC implementation, we can, we'll have to make decisions as to do we go down this road path or not. So the next is so Thomas looked at the video and heard the video and saw and read the paper, and so it's got some useful concepts. And I'm sure we can I think we can borrow some very useful concepts from that. But it would be nice if they had the open source code as a code open source for us to use, because otherwise we just be borrowing some concepts which are kind of generic in a sense. They have entity kinds or entity types, like the kind of we have in onos-topo devices. They have like about 200 or so entity types, right? And about 50 or so relationships between entity relationships. So we could start with defining our own entity, kinds or types and entity relationships.
Right. I think kind of the reason I wanted us to take a look at it was not necessarily to be able to reuse the code, because as you mentioned, there is really no code, because I mean, there is code, but it's within Google and it's heavily married to the Google infrastructure, and also contains, according to Jeff, contains some craft that they wouldn't want to open source anyway, some legacy artifacts. But what I wanted us to do is take a look at it and reuse the high-level concepts. And we don't necessarily need to implement this whole hog, because I don't think we necessarily have an immediate need for this. But I think we could probably borrow at least the basic concept of using entity relationship as a basis for storing and expressing the information about the topology. And the reason I bring that up is because this is in contrast to how ONOS Classic expresses the topology. The ONOS Classic just exposes it as basically a network graph, but it's solely concerned about data plane. And even on a data plane side, it doesn't really have sufficiently fine grain to be able to express various nuances of the data plane. For example, people who worked on the optical extension will be able to vouch for this. because I don't think the ONOS classic topology scheme allows you to capture, for example, unidirectionality of certain pathways. Optical devices are not necessarily fully interconnected meshes within the device itself, meaning if traffic comes in on one port, it doesn't necessarily guarantee it can egress on any other port. That's not the case. And ONOS classic topology doesn't really allow you to easily express that. There are workarounds, but yeah, that's a limitation. Sure. And so what I wanted us for ONOS topology to be able to look at maybe something that's a little bit looser in terms of the maybe like looser as in more free form, and entity relationships will allow us to basically have generic objects as vertices or as the entities, and the relationships themselves are effectively kinds of entities as well, but they are basically between two kinds of entities. And but otherwise they're fully fledged objects in the information base, and can be annotated however we want to. And my thought was that we could, if we have such a fairly flexible scheme, we should be able to use it to express both control plane relationships, user plane relationships, as well as management plane and obviously data plane relationships. Now, just because it's kind of open-ended and free form, that clearly brings with it certain sets of caveats, right? Because there have to be eventually some agreement on what are the semantics of these, entities and relationships. So I think that will bring with it another set of issues that Jeff talks about in his paper. And I think we can probably defer dealing with some of those. For example, how to evolve the schema over time. Right. I think for now, if you just set it up as an entity relationship type of a scheme, then we should be able to start capturing or slowly extending the topology with relationships about, let's say, like you said, between Rick and the various top-level E2 nodes that Rick will be communicating with, but possibly also to be able to express the relationships between the various elements of the disaggregated base station itself, even though that's not something, let's say, Rick may necessarily be exposed to, at least initially, but it may be something that's required by the orchestration software as we're setting up basically as we're bringing up the base station as part of the zero-touch provisioning. Right? Because we may need to know about certain hardware elements, and we may need to also create certain software counterparts for those things. Let's say the DU and RU will be some sort of a hardware element that may be in a single box, or maybe disaggregating between the DU and RU parts. But then a CUU and CUC we know those will be software elements in the edge cloud, and they will need to be provisioned as part of the overall edge cloud provisioning. And so we will probably need to know all of those relationships. Maybe Rick itself does not need to know it because let's say it may not be doing the provisioning, but it may still need to know how it's set up so that it can properly navigate things.
True. Yeah. So yeah. So we'll start with we'll start with this concrete use case of modeling the relationship between E2 nodes and possibly the E2 interface itself and between the RIC and the E2 node. And I guess that'll be a good starting point for us for these enhancements.
Yeah, I think somewhere there's a line where topo is like really reflecting the lower level connections, but when it gets into configuration and control, really, topo is only there as a facility to help things go in the right direction, like with IP addresses and identification of links and that kind of thing. And that's kind of what I liked about the Google Malt, this multiple layer idea, you know. So, I mean, maybe the lower layer is in onos-topo, higher layers are in, you know, onos-config or, you know, RIC or control or something like that. So yeah, I think in any case, what you said, Shad, is valid. I think the E2 connectivity really is a valid case for it.
Right. Yeah. So we will start with that, and I think we'll evolve as we go. And Thomas just concluded with the next slide is, yeah, I guess I just wanted to be clear about what, you know, who's the user of an onos-topo. Is that like for example, we have these handover and load balancing app. Do we expect these apps to be querying onos-topo for I mean, for example, are we going to model UEs and like a query like give me all the UEs on a specific base station? Is that something that is that we would envision onos-topo for or not? So I'm just trying to understand who's going to be using this information other than, yeah, of course, initial provisioning, adding a E2 node, you know, provisioning is going to be involved. But other than that, who's the user for this other than displaying the CLI, for example?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I suppose there's multiple different ways one can view this, but I guess my kind of intuitive, my intuition is to use the topology as basically use the topology subsystem as a way to express, to track inventory of the major network assets and their relationships. And relationships here meaning not only necessarily the data plane connectivity, but also the control plane management plane too. And given that definition, my suggestion would be to keep the UEs out of this, because the UEs here, I mean, they could be kept in here as well too, obviously. And that's, I'm not necessarily vehemently opposed to that at all. I just would probably urge us to exercise caution before we blindly say, yes, this will contain UEs as well. This is not to say that UEs are not important at all, but I think UEs in a wireless context are far more ephemeral, numerous, and have different sets of requirements. They're not necessarily kind of the major assets, I suppose. And for that, we should scrutinize whether or not onos-topo should track those.
Okay, right. Yeah, I'm kind of in agreement over that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think we kind of thought, when we thought about it previously, it was like configurable UEs, like say wireless mesh routers or something like this might be represented in it if there was a need for it.
Right. And clearly, I mean, UEs will have to be tracked somewhere. The question is whether topo is the right place for it to happen, or whether it's you know, as a subsystem that's kind of adjacent to onos-RIC, or you know, sidecar to onos-RIC, or whether it's RIC itself that provides that information as part of the shared information model. Yeah, you'll have to decide. But I think for right now, clearly, I think the primary focus of attention should be the E2 nodes and the RIC itself.
right.
We need to be able to capture the control relationships, because primarily we'll be concerned with control plane and user plane at this point in time. And I think having kind of a looser structure for capturing this information and to be able to extend it depending on the requirements as we learn them will be helpful. Rather than having a sort of a fixed structure, right? And as opposed to, I'm just basically trying to contrast it with what Onos Classic has done, which worked really well in certain senses, but it had its limitations, to what we should do in the future. And I think we should probably evolve towards more flexible, multifaceted data model.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. So yeah, so we'll start with this specific goals of modeling the interfaces. I mean, generic way of entity types for interfaces, and then some sort of entity relationships to be able to link a device type and an interface type and kind of chain them. Yeah.
And I think the users of the use cases here, I think this list is good in a sense that Axe apps will most likely be the ones purely consuming this, and the RIC itself will be consuming this. ZTP will probably be also consuming it and kind of making sure that whatever it sees corresponds to reality. And the external OSS BSS will be using it in terms of writing into it, meaning, basically prescribing what the environment should look like.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So that's all I had just to share. Ray, if you want to take it from here.
Yeah. So, but before we dive into the other subject, so is there sort of an agreement on kind of the approach, or is there any objections to kind of the suggested approach of using entity relationships to start modeling the nodes and the relationships between the E2 entities and the RIC itself, and potentially the Axe apps as well? Any serious objections to that?
No objections. I actually really like this idea. I think it'll potentially save us a lot of time in the future, and sort of simplifies the problem of approaching a new problem, because it gives us a generic framework within which to model things. And I also agree with what you said about the UEs. I was thinking about this last week. I think UEs, or things like UEs, because they're so ephemeral, and like you mentioned, the state has to be managed in a different way, potentially. So we'll probably cross that bridge when we come to it. I think initially we can just implement it in onos-ric, and if there's some problem with that later, then we can make a decision then.
Yeah, that's my thinking as well.
Right.
Sean shared the malt paper with the ops team, and I had eyes on it as because we've been discussing sort of practical IPAM or DCIM tools for tracking things, at least at the hardware level.
Right.
So it would be interesting to see at what level there's a meeting between that sort of information and the information kept in onos-topo.
Right, and also because what is kind of the overall, where's going to be the resource management too? Because if you really think about it, Helm and Kubernetes also do certain aspects of this too, right?
Right.
Even though they're primarily just concerned with kind of the services and associated resources in cloud, but there's an overlap there as well. And so, yeah, we'll have to be watching this carefully. I don't want us to broaden the scope too wide because then it becomes difficult to do coordination, and potentially, the seeming similarities end up being fairly superfluous. So I don't want us to get us bound up into organizing this into a very wide scope and generic system. But I think at the same time, on the other hand, it's important to make sure that we also don't end up creating these two very similar silos that are just different enough to cause problems, but yet they share a lot of the same functions and responsibilities. So we have to definitely keep an eye on these similarities arise, and then figure out how to consolidate from there.
Yeah, exactly. It's really a scoping thing to deal with. Sean?
Yeah, I was going to ask, last week we talked about, do we want to persist the link as a relationship type of object, or was it an attribute we were going to add to both sides of the entity?
No, the link itself should be its own object for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so that it can be, it can have its own type, and it can be extended fully. And basically, when you're traversing, you can traverse things by. I think it should be both entities and relationships to fundamentally separate objects, but they will still share a lot of similarities in how we treat them underneath.
Yeah, Sean, I thought about, I mean, that going down the attribute thing is probably easy implementation. But I guess what Thomas is mentioning, that having the link as its own native object will probably be more flexible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's slightly higher maintenance with it internally, but still, I mean, it's very much doable. You know, if a device disappears, the link can go, you know, I guess redundant, or sorry, no, I guess it can go out of service or some sort of deprecated sort of state, and maybe it can be deleted eventually. But yeah, you've got a link to maintain now, and it's got to be, you know, connected into the life cycle of the device, and that's really. I know we have a state attribute in Topo. We have several of them. You know, I guess that's something then that the link can track, I guess, dynamically. You know, if one or other sides go down, say for GNMI or for EA or E2, for instance, you know, the link state would show that as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you think that's within scope for this sprint?
I guess so. Even I had the same thoughts. I mean, in any traditional NMS, you have a similar concept. You can pre-provision a link even when the other endpoint, when either of the endpoints are not there. And then when a device comes up, that's when the endpoint of the link would get active. So yeah, in traditional NMSs, links have a life of their own. So I guess it's in this. We could have it in the scope. It probably, it gets a little bit more complicated than just having a link as an attribute. But let's see how. Let's start on this implementation. See, I don't think it will be, you know.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think there is multiple levels, right? I think structurally there needs to be certain sets of invariants in place that need to be maintained. Like, for example, relationship will require that the two subjects of the relationship are there, the two entities. You know, we cannot have hanging links, right? But in terms of what that link expresses, and for example, if you have a, let's say, link expressing relationship between, let's say, RU and a DU, clearly the RU has to be there as an entity, the DU has to be there as an entity, and the link is there now as an entity, but the state that it carries, you know, now clearly you can, let's say you have a link that indicates that this is active, but then one of the entities in the data model is actually inactive. Well, structurally the model maintains integrity, but then semantically what it expresses is a little bit incoherent. But I think that's okay. For that we can come up with sort of validation tools and things like that to be able to catch those things. But I think structurally it has to be, the structure has to remain correct, and whatever update mechanism you use within onos-topo service has to make sure that the integrity is maintained. Semantically, it's...
I think sorry, I was going to say, I think the case of that you mentioned, Shad, of adding the RIC as an entity is an interesting one as well, you know, because, you know, maybe when you add something like RIC, you don't keep, like currently we keep the E2AP state on the device, but maybe we should keep it on the link.
Exactly.
Because the link then, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Exactly, right.
Okay, and the same with onos-config for GNMI, etc.
Precisely, and now you could have different protocol connections associated with the same device. You could express those as different kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
And the entity themselves could now be simplified and don't have to carry this hidden meaning inside some of those dedicated fields.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think finally then the, you know, if there were two instances of RIC I guess both of those instances would need to be in that entity list.
Yes.
Am I right?
Well, or would have separate relationships potentially.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think it would be necessary because if you look at E2, there is a ID for the rig. Part of the messages that we send down to the devices.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it helps to initialize that ID.
Sean, when you mention instances of NIC, do you mean like in a cluster, like multiple instances in the cluster, or completely two different NIC?
Yes, yes, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay, right, got it. Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's a good point. Since our E2 connections are nailed point to point, we don't have like a load balance in the middle. So yeah, to depict this relationship, we'll need multiple instances of RIC if they are to be represented in onos-topo.
So I think this is useful. Then, if we have an agreement here, then I think this gives Shad and the team in general kind of a direction to move in, right? For the onos-topo enhancements.
So the summary is we model. In addition to, I mean, we have a RIC as a device type maybe, and we model in another object in addition to devices.
Yeah. So my suggestion would be to tactically speaking, to how to basically start bringing this enhancement into the code would be to leave the existing device subsystem as it is, just leave that there.
Mm-hmm.
And then slowly bootstrap basically this entity relationship based model on a side, because we have the API/device API admin and API diag kind of sub areas of the topo service API, and maybe just bring up a new region there, a new set of basically a new protobuf definition there, that you have completely clear ground for bootstrapping this entity relationship view of the world. And then I think we can slowly migrate away from the kind of the fixed device view that we have, because there's a number of subsystems like onos-config and a number of RIC itself too, I think, that are currently using it. But I think how we're using it, how those other subsystems are using it is usually fairly confined. So I think it will be fairly simple to make those changes once the new entity relationship based approach is implemented. That's what I would suggest.
Right. It makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Because that way we can first. Go ahead, Sean. Sorry.
No, I was going to say when it all settles down, maybe in the next sprint, then we can look at a GUI for representing these links.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that will be very, very useful because and that's something that's specifically brought up by Jeff in his talk and paper. Because it's really it's going to be really vital to be able to express and navigate filtered views of the information in there, because now it will contain a variety of well, first of all, multiple types of relationships. So, you may not necessarily want to view the data plane, you may only view the control plane, or vice versa.
Yeah, very good. And this time we'll build in layering from the start.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, that's all I have, Thomas.
No, thank you for putting up the slides and leading this charge. Thanks, Chad. This is really useful. Okay, so I think we can move on to the next item, which is the automatic component releases on Travis, the work that Ray has been doing tirelessly for a while. Do you want to take the charge on this, Ray?
Sure. So we had been using this kind of clunky manual process to release things, required pushing tags and images from a developer's laptop, which I never like, because then you have environment creep into your system. This is very error prone because it was following a recipe by hand. there was no peer review, so it was basically like, yeah, it's time to do a release, let's do a release. That's not a problem now, but moving forward, that will become more of an issue. And because of the way we were doing things, we were releasing everything at once. So that basically meant that, for example, if you had a bug fix in onos-ric, you had to release everything in order to update all the dependencies and everything. That is not what we want. We really want to be able to have every component on its own release cadence. So we've been talking for a while about wanting an automated process. We want a process that's driven by code rather than a pull by developers. We want it to be able to be reviewed so the team can say, yeah, we're ready for release, and then we can push the button and make it happen. We want this executed by the CI system rather than by some developer on their machine. I personally don't like that we have to have push access to Git. I think that always terrifies me. And we wanted a model that would not require that. We can release a component by itself. That's one of the main things. And we also, there's been a bunch of work that Zach and other folks did on some of the other ONF projects that are already using a model like this. So I discussed this with Zach and came up with a plan that's actually very similar to what they're doing. So can you flip to the next one, Thomas? Thank you. So the way it works is each repo, so onos-config, onos-topo, on and on and on, has a version file. In there, there's a string that indicates what the current version is. So when we're doing development, it has -dev at the end of it. And you'll see in a minute why that's important. When it's time comes to do a release, we remove that -dev from that string and check in the file. It gets reviewed normally, so people look at it and they say, yes, it's time to release 065. And then when we merge that PR, like we would any other PR, there's some code on the Travis side that notices that change. It does some checking to be sure that that's a valid release version and that it hasn't been released before. When those checks all pass, after the build, it tags the tree with that version, sticking the V in front of it because Go likes the V in front of it. It pushes up a tag indicating that the release was done, and more importantly, it pushes up the images with that tag to Docker Hub. As part of this automated process, the version file is then automatically updated to be what the next release would be, which is the next minor release -dev, and that's also committed. So when this is done, think of it as the way that snapshots worked in Onos Classic. When you release version 1.2.1, now you're working on 1.2.2 snapshot. It's a similar kind of thing. Okay, next slide, please, Thomas.
Yep. Quick question here, Ray. So let's say if you wanted to jump major version number, that 0.6.6-dev can be then manually changed to something else -dev by developer, right?
Correct. The scripting that bumps that minor version is very dumb. It basically just looks at the third digit and increments it.
Yeah, that's all we need. I just wanted to make sure what the process was for.
Yeah, that would if you were going to do a major release version, you would do that manually.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So that's what we've got in place. I actually have it working now for Rick, config, topo, GUI, and I added a couple more this morning. The incremental work to add it to a new repo is really not that bad. The annoying thing is that unlike Jenkins, on Travis, there's no way to have job templates. So for each repo, I have to generate a new key, which is annoying. So it's just a manual process. I have to do it. I'll finish the rest of them probably today. I've discussed with Jordan that he would like to put a similar mechanism into Atomics, so we can do the same kind of thing there where we do releases through a PR system rather than through running scripts. The next big chunk of this will be, so we have an overarching chart for SDRAM, which currently has references to the versions of things it depends on. We would like to have a way to do similar what I just described for each of the components. We'd like to have that for the charts as well. We've discussed a way to do it. I think I know how to do it, but I need to circle back with Jordan again and figure out what we need to implement. And we still have the glorious, lovely Golang problem of our GoMod dependencies, which, since we're not going with a model of everybody has the same version string, which is what we want, This means now that you have to manage each of your go.mod files. And I don't know if there's a way to make that better, but it's kind of ugly the way it is now. So we've just.
But I think it's okay for right now. I think it's all right. I mean, it has its downsides, but I think there's also downsides in forcing everything onto the same version too.
Yeah, I agree. I think the keeping everybody at the same release has many more downsides than having to do the manual go.mod updates.
Yep.
And I just wanted to do a shout out to Zach. Thanks for all your help. I actually swiped some of your scripts and adapted them a little bit. If you look in the tree, you'll smirk to see some of your code in there. So that's it for the automated build stuff. Anybody have any questions?
I had a few just technical ones.
Sure, go ahead.
So when you're bumping the version after a Semver version has been released, is that just done as a straight push, or are you making PRs?
Straight push.
Okay.
So the idea is that for better or worse, the PR that defines the new release is the one that's reviewed. After that, it's all fire and forget.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't see any issues with that, Zach, do you?
No, the only thing we've had is occasionally we've had library repos that we're only dependent on, and so it made sense to always have them have Semver releases, so they just jump from 0.65 to 0.66, and it was a manual process. So there are trade-offs there of having it be a manual versus an automated process. It really comes down to what developers expect.
Yeah.
And
in this model, that could very easily be done. You would just change the Travis.yaml to not include the thing that does the update, and you're golden.
Right.
So,
right. Are you allowing if somebody comes because it's doing that automatic update and push? There's not a case where somebody could try to integrate another change that allows two patches to have the same version.
No, it'll fail out because the tag will exist.
Okay. Do you have a problem of a PR being approved, like two PRs being approved that release the same version and one getting merged and then the other one's being allowed to merge?
Yes. Right now, there's no intelligence in the PR validity check that would say, hey, this is a new Semver, and does the new Semver exist? That would be pretty easy to add, and that's actually a good idea. We don't have that right now. What will happen is the merge build will fail.
Right. And yeah, but that would still, the merge would still happen, so you'd still have two things with the same version. You just wouldn't move the tag.
The
Right.
version file would be correct, but there would be a gap that was sort of uncommitted.
Right.
A gap in commits, I mean, because the first one would be in there, the second one wouldn't.
Right. Yeah, that we in the chord system we forced linear or forced history to be linear on commits, and people have to rebase. They couldn't do a merge.
That's another way to fix it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's different ways to do it.
I believe GitHub forces that. I'm not sure. I know we had issues with this on
you can configure GitHub that way. So yeah, that's just something we ran into of when we had a bunch of people committing to the same repo and doing versioning. So
okay.
Yeah,
that's a good
point.
point.
Yeah, this is good.
You don't have to add it.
Yep. Okay. Are you pushing, when you push your Docker images, do they get the V tag or do they have the bare version?
V.
Okay.
I just followed what was in there before. That was not a decision I made. I just followed the path.
Yeah, there's no reason for us to depart from having consistent approach unless there's concrete issues, and we would certainly bring those up.
Right.
Okay. Ray, if I want to make a release, and I'm pushing a PR, should I change the version file in my PR with all the code changes, or should I, commit my code changes and then do a separate PR for the version? Which would you prefer?
That's an excellent question. I think I would prefer to have the version file as a separate, sort of line in the sand.
I concur.
Okay, yeah.
But there's nothing that prevents you from doing it the other way.
Yeah, but I agree that
Oh.
stylistically we should just basically do the PR for version completely separate.
I mean, I
Okay.
actually adopted like a specific format of the commit message that I'm using on all of these that says, releasing version blah of component blah.
And it's one file to
Only for the
review,
version
right?
file.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mostly did that because that's what Onos Classic does.
Yeah, I think just for stylistically, that's probably what we ought to follow. I mean, it creates a little more PRs, but I think it's a little bit safer.
I also like the fact that it sort of advertises to the team, like, hey, we're doing a release here. Does anybody have an issue with this? That was my main reason for wanting to do it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's easier to track back what changed and when.
Right.
When you're building Docker images, are you building Docker images on just on release builds, or are you doing them for per branch? And how are if you're doing them per branch and following dev, what's the build process?
They're built on every merge commit. They are pushed to Docker Hub with the tag latest. If it's one of these special guys that changes the version, they're re-tagged with that version stamp and then pushed again.
Okay, that makes sense. I would probably one of the things we also ran into is deciding what latest means.
Oh, I know. I mean, we only run off master right now, so we don't have this issue. But once we have like support branches and stuff, this is all going to fall apart.
Yeah.
Better way to do it.
But isn't SRE kind of specifically advocate against branches?
So it's okay to have a support branch, of course. If you're, it depends whether you're deciding you want to build everything from master and only deal with what's on master, and that's I'm not sure we can get everyone to agree with that. But what we've been doing in some of the other systems is we build not latest, but we build with the branch tag. So we have a master branch, and that way it's more clear how that aligns to the code.
Yeah. Makes sense. So latest is master, and then branch is branch tag.
Yeah. The problem is that latest doesn't always mean master for a lot of projects.
Correct.
Might be
right.
For an Ubuntu image might be like the latest stable release, not developed release. So
And doesn't latest have magical properties? If you don't specify anything, you get latest.
yeah, it does. Yeah, there's the problem is it's very inconsistently applied in the public space of Docker images.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a
The
small.
main reason that we do this push to the latest is because that's how the integration tests work. They're always based on whatever the latest and greatest is, and they just refer to the latest image for everything, pull it into the chart, and then run the test.
Yeah. All right. So I think we have about 8 minutes left or so before the end of the meeting.
Yeah, there was one item that Sean put up.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So really, somebody asked me about, I think I was talking to Carmelo about these issues in Jira on Onus Classic in relation to the GUI. And there are some of them there, like, we must put in all the internationalization for, we'll say, the flows view, for instance. If you scroll down a bit on the left-hand side, there's like a lot of dead wood there, and things not related to GUI 2. Let's see, so
Shall I let you share?
A line, 6727 there for the settings view. Do we want all that localization, internationalization?
No, I don't think so. What do you think, Thomas?
I say, but right now, not worry about that, right? I mean, I think we should probably prune this list would be my suggestion.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these are old.
Yeah, June 17, so that's
Exactly, yeah.
3 years it's been sitting there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can go through them, and I'll put a disposition on them of we're not going to fix it.
No.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because we
I mean,
need to eliminate the clutter here a little bit, because especially if we don't have any intention to invest efforts in that area.
yeah, and I think it's not something just one developer can do either, because, you know, for instance, to get a translated version of, I don't know, settings, even the word settings in like 20 different languages is not something that you can just look up on the internet.
Yeah, we had a whole brigade working on this before.
Correct. Yeah, Eliza was she was heading it, and she's still an ambassador. But yeah, I don't think, even like development-wise, we probably should not invest in this, especially since this is on the. Yeah, I think, especially since this stuff is going to mutate into a GUI to another, and micro-onos GUI, right? So I would think I would probably just pinch to put a pin in these issues and just let them stay out.
Yep.
Unless people ask for it, right? Then it's different. Then we can start talking about you know, how to bring up a brigade into helping us do this. But I think these were put in by Simon a couple of years ago, almost 3 years ago now, really, to bring consistency into it. But then, you know, we basically ran out of steam to be able to do these.
Yes, it's a big effort. Yeah. Okay, that's all. I just wanted to get your opinion on those.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Anyway, I wanted to thanks again everybody for preparing content and having a really interesting discussion. I think this is really productive. Again, we'll continue this in more detail and depth on Slack channels and through the various GitHub reviews. So thanks again. And unless there are any other questions, I think we can call the meeting done. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll see you everybody in 2 weeks and online in the meantime. And I'll post the recording of this on YouTube sometimes before the end of today. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.